The echo of the judge's gavel cut through the stifling air of courtroom 302. Bradley adjusted his bespoke Italian suit, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips as he glanced at the woman sitting across the aisle. Coralie, his soon-to-be ex-wife, wore a faded navy blazer, her hands neatly folded over a cheap, scuffed faux leather purse. "She is a financial parasite, Your Honor," Bradley's lawyer sneered, the words dripping with manufactured pity. "My client shouldn't be responsible for her generational poverty." Bradley chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. He was completely unaware that the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room were about to swing open, bringing a brutal, permanent end to his smug existence. Coralie Miller lived a lie, but it was a lie built on a foundation of genuine love and a desperate desire for normalcy. When she first met Bradley Hayes at a dingy, rain-swept coffee shop in South Boston 7 years ago, she introduced herself as a freelance graphic designer, scraping by on gig work. She drove a faded silver 2008 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper. She rented a shoebox apartment above a noisy laundromat. She wore thrifted sweaters and bought her groceries with coupons. Bradley, at the time, was a hungry, sleep-deprived law student at Boston University. He was charming, fiercely ambitious, and seemingly enchanted by Coralie's quiet grace. They bonded over cheap takeout and late-night walks along the Charles River. Coralie fell in love with his drive. Bradley, she believed, fell in love with her soul. What Bradley didn't know, what absolutely no one in Coralie's modest social circle knew, was that Coralie Miller was an alias. Her legal name was Coralie Kensington. Her father was Richard Kensington, a man whose wealth was a phantom presence in the global economy. Richard was not a flashy billionaire who bought sports teams or launched rockets. He was a ruthless, fiercely private titan who controlled a staggering network of rare earth mineral mines in Africa, vast agricultural expanses in South America, and silent majority stakes in 3 of the world's largest tech conglomerates. Financial analysts who dared to dig into the Kensington holding companies estimated the family's net worth was brushing against the $1 trillion mark, a sum so vast it was practically abstract. Richard had raised Coralie after her mother's death with one strict, unyielding philosophy. Wealth attracts vultures. Let them love you for your mind, not your vault. So, Coralie hid her identity. When she and Bradley married in a tiny, inexpensive civil ceremony, her father attended in a plain grey suit, posing as a retired accountant. Bradley barely spoke to the man, viewing his new father-in-law as just another middle-class nobody who couldn't offer him any leverage or connections. As the years passed, the marriage began to rot from the inside out. Bradley passed the bar and clawed his way into a junior partnership at Harrison, Ford & Wright, one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in Massachusetts. As his salary swelled, so did his ego. The charming, driven student mutated into a vain, status-obsessed narcissist. He began to resent Coralie's frugality, her lack of high society polish, and her refusal to beg her accountant father for a down payment on a luxury townhouse in Beacon Hill. "You have a poverty mindset, Coralie," Bradley would snap, adjusting his Rolex in the mirror while she made him breakfast. "You drag me down. I'm out here swimming with sharks, and you're perfectly content, floating in a kiddie pool. It's embarrassing." The final blow came 6 months ago. Bradley didn't just drift away, he violently severed their bond. Coralie found a trail of extravagant charges on a shared credit card. Weekend trips to Aspen, thousands of dollars at Cartier, reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants. The beneficiary of this newfound generosity was Jessica Trent, a senior partner's daughter. Jessica was everything Coralie pretended not to be: loud, dripping in inherited designer labels, and relentlessly entitled. When Coralie confronted him, Bradley didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, stared her dead in the eye, and delivered a speech that would haunt her for months. "Let's be honest, Coralie," he had said, his voice as cold as ice. "You were a starter wife. You were good for when I was eating ramen and studying for the bar. But I'm in the big leagues now. Jessica belongs in my world. You? You belong in that dented Honda. I want a divorce, and I'm taking everything I earned. You haven't contributed a dime to my success." He forced her out of their rented apartment that very night. Coralie packed her meager, thrifted belongings into garbage bags, her heart shattered. She didn't call her father's security team. She didn't tap into the offshore trust funds waiting for her 30th birthday. She simply drove to a cheap motel, sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, and cried until her lungs ached. 3 weeks before the final divorce hearing, tragedy struck. Richard Kensington suffered a massive, fatal stroke in his private estate in the Swiss Alps. Coralie's world stopped turning. The grief was a physical weight, crushing the breath from her lungs. She flew to Zurich under the radar, burying the only family she had left in a private, heavily guarded ceremony. When she returned to Boston for the divorce proceedings, she was a ghost of her former self. Bradley hadn't even noticed she was gone. He hadn't offered condolences, unaware that the retired accountant he so deeply despised had passed away. He was too busy strategizing with his lawyer on how to leave Coralie with absolutely nothing. Suffolk County Family Court was a sterile, unforgiving place. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, maddening hum, casting a sickly pallor over the worn oak benches. Coralie sat at the respondent's table, her posture rigid. She wore a simple black dress, a silent tribute to her late father, layered under her old navy blazer. She looked exhausted, her pale skin contrasting sharply with the dark circles under her eyes. Across the aisle, Bradley was putting on a show. He was flanked by his aggressive bulldog of a lawyer, Gregory Walsh. In the gallery directly behind them sat Jessica Trent, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit that practically screamed victory. Jessica chewed on a manicured thumbnail, occasionally leaning over the wooden railing to whisper something into Bradley's ear, prompting a cruel, shared laugh. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Judge Miriam Davis, a stern woman with decades of experience on the bench. She adjusted her reading glasses, flipping through the meager financial affidavits submitted by Coralie's court-appointed attorney, a frantic public defender who looked entirely out of his depth. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Davis said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Your client is requesting a disproportionate division of assets, zero spousal support, and this cannot be correct. You are asking that the respondent, Ms. Miller, pay your client's legal fees." "That is correct, Your Honor," Walsh said, standing up and smoothing his tie. He was a theatrical man who treated the courtroom like a stage. "My client, Mr. Hayes, has been the sole financial engine of this marriage. Ms. Miller has contributed virtually nothing to the household estate over the past 7 years. Her stated income from freelance graphic design barely covers her own groceries." Walsh picked up a piece of paper, waving it like a victorious flag. "Let's review the respondent's assets, shall we? A 2008 Honda Civic, valued at approximately $1,200. A checking account at a local credit union containing, let me see, $2,431.18, and a savings account with a grand total of $50. A muffled snicker erupted from Jessica in the gallery. Bradley didn't even try to hide his smirk. He leaned back, crossing his legs, basking in Coralie's public humiliation. "Your Honor," Walsh continued, pacing the floor, Ms. Miller is a financial parasite. She coasted on my client's hard work, his late nights at the firm, his relentless drive. Now that he has achieved a level of success, she is hoping for a payday. We are asking the court to enforce the post-nuptial agreement she signed 3 years ago, which clearly states she waives all rights to his firm's equity and his retirement accounts. Furthermore, because her frivolous contesting of the divorce delayed these proceedings, we believe it is only fair she absorbs the cost of my client's legal representation. Coralie's public defender stood up, his voice shaking slightly. Objection, Your Honor. The post-nuptial agreement was signed under extreme duress. Mr. Hayes threatened to leave my client destitute if she didn't sign it. She had no independent legal counsel. She is an adult, Your Honor, Walsh shot back. Ignorance is not a legal defense. She read it, she signed it. We have the notarized documents. Judge Davis sighed, rubbing her temples. She looked at Coralie with a mixture of pity and frustration. Ms. Miller, did you sign the post-nuptial document presented by your husband 3 years ago? Coralie stood up slowly. Her legs felt like lead. She looked past the judge, past her pathetic lawyer, and locked eyes with Bradley. His eyes were cold, devoid of the boy she once loved. He looked at her as if she were dirt on his shoe. Yes, Your Honor, Coralie said, her voice remarkably steady, though quiet. I signed it. I trusted my husband. Bradley scoffed loudly enough for the court reporter to look up. Trust had nothing to do with it. You just couldn't be bothered to read it. Always lazy, Coralie. Always waiting for a handout. Mr. Hayes, control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt, Judge Davis snapped, slamming her hand on the desk. She turned her sympathetic gaze back to Coralie. Miss Miller, I understand this is a difficult situation, but the law in this state heavily favors written, notarized contracts. Unless you have evidence of coercion or hidden assets that would fundamentally alter the equitable distribution matrix, my hands are largely tied. She has nothing, Your Honor, Bradley interjected, unable to help himself. Her family is a joke. Her father was a broke accountant who lived in a rented condo. She's a charity case, and I am done funding her existence. Render the judgment so I can get back to my actual life. Coralie didn't flinch. She simply absorbed the venom. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Let them show you exactly who they are, Coralie. Give them the rope, and watch what they do with it. Very well, Judge Davis said, her tone heavy with resignation. She gathered her papers, preparing to deliver the final ruling that would leave Coralie penniless, burdened with Bradley's massive legal fees, and entirely broken. Based on the financial affidavits provided, and the legally binding post-nuptial agreement. Before the judge could finish her sentence, the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the courtroom burst open with a loud, resounding crack that made everyone in the room jump. The silence that followed the slamming of the doors was absolute. Every head in courtroom 302 whipped around to see who had dared to interrupt a judge mid-ruling. Standing in the threshold was an imposing figure. It was an elderly man, impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey three-piece suit that cost more than Bradley's car. He held a silver-tipped walking cane, though his posture was perfectly straight, radiating an aura of terrifying authority. Flanking him were two massive men in dark suits with earpieces, private security, moving with the quiet, lethal grace of former special forces. Behind them trailed a team of 4 junior lawyers, each carrying thick, leather-bound briefcases. The elderly man walked down the center aisle, the steady clack, clack, clack of his cane echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He did not look at Jessica. He did not look at Bradley. His eyes were fixed entirely on the bench. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Davis demanded, her voice rising in anger. "Court is in session. Bailiff, remove these men immediately." The bailiff, a heavy-set man nearing retirement, took one step toward the group before one of the security guards locked eyes with him. The bailiff froze, his instincts screaming at him not to interfere. The elderly man stopped at the swinging wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal floor. He opened it and stepped through, coming to a halt right next to Coralie. He turned to her, his harsh features softening into a look of profound, devastating grief. He bowed his head slightly. "Miss Kensington," he said softly, his voice carrying a refined mid-Atlantic accent. "Please accept my deepest, most profound condolences. Your father was a great man. The world is much darker without him." Coralie's stoic facade finally cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she nodded. "Thank you, Arthur." Bradley shot up from his chair, his face flushed with rage. "Who the hell are you? And why are you calling her Kensington? Her name is Miller. Your Honor, I demand this circus be stopped." The elderly man slowly turned his head to look at Bradley. The look of disdain on his face was so intense it practically lowered the temperature in the room. He looked at Bradley the way one might look at a cockroach that had scurried across a dining table. "My name," the man said, his voice booming with practiced theatrical projection, "is Arthur Pendleton. I am the senior managing partner at Pendleton, Roth and Global. I am the executor of the estate of the late Richard Kensington." Gregory Walsh, Bradley's arrogant lawyer, suddenly turned the color of chalk. His jaw went slack, and he dropped the pen he was holding. It rolled off the table and clattered onto the floor. "Pendleton?" Walsh whispered, his bravado entirely evaporating. "Arthur Pendleton from New York. The corporate estate firm?" "The very same," Pendleton replied smoothly, not taking his eyes off Judge Davis. He stepped up to the bench, while his junior lawyers immediately swarmed Coralie's table, gently pushing her public defender aside and opening their briefcases. "Your Honor," Pendleton addressed the judge, reaching into his breast pocket to pull out a sealed, gold-embossed envelope. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. However, I have just arrived from Geneva. I am here to formally file an emergency injunction to halt these divorce proceedings immediately, under penalty of federal fraud statutes." Judge Davis took the envelope, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Mr. Pendleton, I am familiar with your firm by reputation only, but this is a simple family court matter, the division of a few $1,000s and a Honda. What possible grounds do you have for an emergency injunction?" "The grounds, Your Honor, are that the financial affidavits submitted to this court are entirely, spectacularly inaccurate," Pendleton stated, his voice ringing crystal clear. "The respondent, known to this court as Coralie Miller, has been utilizing a legal pseudonym for security purposes since she was 18 years old. Her true legal identity is Coralie Kensington." Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Kensington? What is this? Some kind of prank? She's a graphic designer. Her dad lived in a rental." Pendleton ignored Bradley completely. "Your Honor, 3 weeks ago, my client, Richard Kensington, passed away. As of 8 a.m. this morning, international probate cleared. Miss Coralie Kensington is the sole, uncontested beneficiary of the Kensington Global Trust." Judge Davis broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the heavily watermarked documents. As her eyes scanned the first page, her mouth slightly parted. She looked from the paper to Coralie and back to the paper. "Mr. Pendleton, are these figures accurate? This says the trust is valued at—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to say the number out loud. $940 billion, Your Honor," Pendleton said calmly, the words dropping like a nuclear bomb in the center of the courtroom. "Spread across liquid assets, sovereign bonds, and majority holding shares in 52 multinational corporations." The courtroom descended into a silence so profound it was deafening. Jessica Trent, sitting in the gallery, slowly lowered her hand from her mouth, her face drained of all color. Bradley stared at Pendleton, his brain violently rejecting the information. 90. 900 billion? You're out of your mind. You're lying. She has $50 in her savings account. She clips coupons for soup. I bought her clothes for 5 years. You bought her a disguise, Mr. Hayes, Pendleton corrected, finally turning to address Bradley directly. A disguise she wore because her father wished for her to find someone who loved her for her character, not her capital. It appears tragically she chose poorly. Pendleton turned back to the judge. Your Honor, because Miss Kensington is now the legal owner of an estate valued at nearly $1 trillion, the financial dynamic of this divorce is fundamentally altered. Furthermore, we have evidence that Mr. Hayes engaged in extensive financial infidelity, siphoning marital funds to entertain his mistress, Miss Trent. Walsh, desperately trying to salvage the situation, stammered out, But, Your Honor, the post-nuptial agreement. She signed it. It waives her rights to his assets, but it doesn't protect hers. If she's a billionaire, my client is entitled to half of the marital estate acquired during the marriage. A slow, predatory smile crept across Arthur Pendleton's weathered face. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Ah, yes, Pendleton purred. The post-nuptial agreement. A fascinating document, Mr. Walsh. Did you draft it yourself? I did, Walsh said, puffing out his chest slightly, sensing a lifeline. And it is ironclad. It is indeed ironclad, Pendleton agreed softly. He walked over to Coralie's table, picked up a copy of the contract, and held it up. Let us read Section 4, Clause B together, shall we? In the event of a dissolution of marriage, both parties mutually waive any and all rights, claims, or interests in the separate property, inheritances, or future windfalls of the other party, ensuring a complete and total financial separation. Pendleton dropped the paper back onto the table. You drafted a document to ensure Miss Kensington couldn't touch Mr. Hayes's mediocre law firm equity. In doing so, Mr. Walsh, you legally, permanently, and irrevocably locked your client out of $1 trillion fortune. He gets nothing. Bradley's knees gave out. He collapsed back into his chair, the breath leaving his body in a pathetic, wheezing gasp as the reality of his own arrogance finally came crashing down upon him. The silence in courtroom 302 stretched until it felt like the very air was snapping. Judge Miriam Davis, a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades presiding over bitter disputes, hidden offshore accounts, and vindictive spouses, was entirely speechless. She adjusted her glasses, leaning forward to examine the watermarks, the raised embossed seals of the Swiss banking authorities, and the notarized signatures from 3 different international regulatory bodies. They were perfectly, undeniably authentic. Mr. Walsh, Judge Davis finally said, her voice dropping an octave, devoid of any judicial neutrality. Your client, Mr. Hayes, has spent the better part of the last hour berating this woman for her lack of financial contribution. You stood in my courtroom and mockingly read out a savings account balance of $50. Gregory Walsh swallowed hard. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the harsh fluorescent light. Your Honor, we had no knowledge of this estate. My client was operating under the assumption that— Your client, Pendleton interrupted smoothly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, was operating under the assumption that he could bully a woman he perceived as weak. He assumed he could bleed her dry, stick her with his legal fees, and waltz out of this room with his mistress. An assumption that has just cost him a fortune so vast, Mr. Walsh, that your calculator lacks the digital real estate to display it. Bradley's face had drained of its arrogant flush, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He stared at Coralie as if she had suddenly transformed into a mythological creature. "Coralie," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Coralie, this is a joke, right? Your dad, he was an accountant. He drove a Buick. I met him. I shook his hand." Coralie stood up from the respondent's table. The timid, exhausted woman who had walked into the courtroom was gone. In her place stood the sole heir to the Kensington Empire. She didn't look triumphant. She looked remarkably, devastatingly calm. "My father drove a Buick because he valued humility over horsepower, Bradley," Coralie said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "He built an empire from the dirt up, and he knew what money did to people. He knew it turned them into parasites. He wanted to make sure I found someone who loved me when I had nothing but a rusted Honda and a cheap apartment. For a while, I truly believed you did." "I did," Bradley said, scrambling out of his chair, taking a desperate step towards the aisle. "Coralie, come on. You know I did. We built our life together. Those late nights in South Boston, the takeout, the dreams. I was just stressed. The firm, the partnership track, it got to my head. We can fix this. We don't need these lawyers." A sharp, disgusted scoff came from the gallery. Jessica Trent had stood up, her white Chanel suit looking suddenly stark and foolish. She stared at Bradley, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and sudden, visceral revulsion. "Are you kidding me, Bradley?" Jessica hissed, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "You're begging her? You told me she was a deadweight loser." Bradley whipped around, his eyes wild. "Jess, shut up. Just wait outside." "Wait outside?" Jessica's face twisted into a sneer. She looked at Coralie, then at Pendleton, and finally back to Bradley. The math was doing itself in her head. Bradley had just lost half of $1 trillion fortune because of a post-nuptial agreement his own lawyer drafted. Worse, if Pendleton pursued the financial infidelity claims, Bradley would be buried in litigation for the rest of his natural life. He was no longer a rising star. He was a financial black hole. "I'm not waiting anywhere," Jessica spat, grabbing her designer handbag. "You're pathetic, Bradley. Lose my number." She turned on her heel and practically sprinted out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind her. Bradley watched her go, entirely unmoored. He turned back to his lawyer. "Walsh, do something. Invalidate the post-nup. You said we could argue unconscionability if the financial disparity was too high." Walsh looked at his client with a mixture of pity and intense professional regret. "Bradley, I argued for the strict enforcement of the contract less than 10 minutes ago on the court record. I cannot suddenly claim the contract is unconscionable just because the financial disparity is not in your favor. It's over." Judge Davis picked up her gavel. The satisfying crack of the wood felt like a final nail in Bradley's coffin. "Given the extraordinary introduction of new evidence, this court grants the emergency injunction," Judge Davis ruled, her tone crisp and final. "The current divorce proceedings are halted. Mr. Pendleton, your firm has 72 hours to file the revised financial affidavits and the formal claims of financial fraud against Mr. Hayes. Furthermore, I am denying Mr. Hayes's request for Ms. Kensington to pay his legal fees. He will bear the cost of his own representation. Court is adjourned." The fallout did not end in the courtroom. It was merely the prologue to Bradley's systematic destruction. 48 hours after the disastrous hearing, Bradley walked into the opulent glass and steel lobby of Harrison, Ford and Wright. He had spent the last 2 days in a manic spiral, drinking heavily and leaving dozens of unanswered voicemails on Coralie's phone. He was convinced that if he could just get her in a room, turn on the old charm and apologize, she would take him back. She was Coralie after all. Soft, forgiving, frugal Coralie. He rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, straightening his tie, desperately trying to project the image of a junior partner in control. But as he stepped off the elevator, the atmosphere in the office felt wrong. The administrative assistants avoided his gaze. The junior associates abruptly stopped talking as he walked past their cubicles. Before he could even reach his corner office, the senior managing partner's secretary stepped into his path. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice entirely devoid of its usual warmth. "Mr. Harrison requires your presence in the main conference room immediately." Bradley's stomach plummeted. Robert Harrison was a notoriously ruthless man, the kind of corporate shark Bradley had idolized and tried to emulate. Bradley swallowed his panic, nodded, and walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the glass-walled conference room. When he opened the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. Robert Harrison was seated at the head of the long mahogany table, looking unusually pale. Seated to his right was Arthur Pendleton. To his left were two of the silent, heavily built private security men who had flanked Pendleton in the courtroom. "Close the door, Bradley," Harrison said. It wasn't a request. Bradley closed the door, his hands trembling slightly. "Robert, what is going on? What is he doing here?" Pendleton didn't speak. He simply opened a leather portfolio, extracted a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the polished wood toward Harrison. "Bradley," Harrison began, refusing to make eye contact. "Harrison, Ford & Wright is a prestigious firm. We represent some of the largest logistical and maritime shipping companies on the eastern seaboard. Our anchor client, as you know, is Apex Holdings." "Of course," Bradley said, his voice tight. "They account for 40% of our annual billable hours. What does that have to do with my divorce?" Pendleton steepled his fingers, leaning back in the plush leather chair. "Apex Holdings, Mr. Hayes, is a subsidiary of a Dutch shell corporation, which is, in turn, wholly owned by the Kensington Global Trust, a trust currently controlled entirely by your soon-to-be ex-wife." Bradley felt the air leave his lungs. The room began to spin. "At 9 a.m. this morning," Harrison continued, his voice tight with suppressed anger, "Mr. Pendleton informed me that Kensington Global is restructuring its legal representation worldwide. They are terminating all contracts with firms that employ individuals deemed ethically compromised." Harrison finally looked up, his eyes blazing with fury. "You lied on your financial disclosures, Bradley. You siphoned marital assets to buy jewelry and vacations for Jessica Trent, using a firm-issued corporate card to hide the paper trail before reimbursing it. You exposed this firm to a catastrophic liability." "Robert, I can explain. It was a mistake. I was stressed." "You cost me a $50 million a year retainer," Harrison roared, slamming his fist on the table. The sheer force of his anger made Bradley flinch backward. "You let your ego and your pathetic social climbing jeopardize the livelihood of 300 employees in this building. Because you thought your wife was a nobody." Harrison took a deep breath, smoothing his suit jacket. He looked at Pendleton, adopting a deferential, almost pleading tone. "Mr. Pendleton, as we discussed, we have zero tolerance for financial impropriety." Harrison turned back to Bradley. "You are terminated, effective immediately, for cause. You are stripped of your junior partnership. You will receive no severance. Security will escort you to your office. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings, and then you will be escorted off the premises. If you attempt to contact any client of this firm, I will personally see to it that you are disbarred." Bradley stood frozen, his world collapsing into ash. The corner office he had sacrificed his marriage for, the prestige he had lorded over Coralie, the wealth he thought he had secured. It was all gone in the blink of an eye. "You can't do this," Bradley whispered, a pathetic, broken sound. "I have nothing. The post-nup. I don't get any of her money, and now I don't have an income. The legal fees from Walsh alone." Arthur Pendleton stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. He looked down at Bradley with eyes as cold as a winter sea. "Your former wife sends her regards, Mr. Hayes," Pendleton said quietly. "She asked me to pass along a message. She said to tell you that she hopes you enjoy swimming with the sharks, because she just drained your kiddie pool." The transition from a thrift store-wearing graphic designer to the helm of a trillion-dollar global syndicate was not a matter of simply signing a check. It was a profound, almost tectonic ascension. Coralie Kensington shed the guise of Coralie Miller, with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone taking off a heavy, waterlogged winter coat. She left behind the dreary Boston motel, stepping onto a private, heavily guarded Gulfstream jet that carried her to the Kensington family's sprawling, fortified penthouse overlooking Central Park. The New York residence was a fortress of silent, unimaginable wealth. Walls adorned with original veneers, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, and a staff that moved with invisible, anticipatory efficiency. Yet Coralie didn't lounge in her newfound luxury. She did not take a vacation to mourn her marriage, nor did she host lavish galas to announce her arrival to high society. Under Arthur Pendleton's rigorous paternal guidance, she threw herself entirely into the labyrinthine machinery of her father's empire. She spent her days in heavily encrypted, subterranean boardrooms. Initially, the silver-haired executives who ran the subsidiary conglomerates looked at her with polite, veiled skepticism. A young woman thrust into a world of cutthroat global finance. It took exactly 1 week for her to disabuse them of their doubts. With a terrifyingly sharp mind, she dissected global supply chains, green-lit massive philanthropic initiatives, and quietly, systematically dismantled the corrupt corporate structures her father had noted in his private, leather-bound ledgers. She was no longer the timid woman who silently absorbed Bradley's insults over burned toast. She was the apex predator of the financial world, moving global markets with a single, softly spoken directive. The grief of losing her father, combined with the visceral betrayal of her marriage, had forged her into something entirely unbreakable. Meanwhile, Bradley Hayes was discovering just how fast a man could reach terminal velocity when he had gleefully severed his own parachute. The legal community in Boston was small, insular, and fueled entirely by schadenfreude and gossip. The story of the arrogant junior partner who had accidentally drafted a post-nuptial agreement, locking himself out of $1 trillion fortune spread like a virulent plague through the city's mahogany-paneled dining clubs and courthouse hallways. Within a week, Bradley was a walking punchline. Every mid-sized firm he applied to politely, and sometimes cruelly, declined to even bring him in for an interview. He was a radioactive liability, a man who had publicly infuriated the most powerful trust on the planet and cost his previous firm a $50 million anchor client. His former champion, Gregory Walsh, proved to have absolutely no loyalty once the financial well ran dry. Upon realizing Bradley had been fired and stripped of his equity, the theatrical bulldog of a lawyer immediately filed a motion to withdraw as his counsel, citing unpaid retainers. He didn't stop there. Walsh ruthlessly slapped Bradley with a lawsuit for outstanding legal fees totaling nearly $80,000. Desperation is a corrosive acid, and it quickly ate through the last of Bradley's polished veneer. His luxury Beacon Hill apartment, the one he had rented specifically to impress Jessica Trent and flaunt his partnership status, issued a brutal, neon-colored eviction notice when his rent check bounced. His credit cards were frozen, maxed out from the extravagant Aspen ski trips and Cartier jewelry he had showered upon his mistress, who had long since blocked his number and vanished from his life. In a frantic, delusional bid for survival, Bradley swallowed the bitter dregs of his pride and took a cheap regional bus to New York City. He didn't have an appointment. He barely had the fare to get to Manhattan, having emptied a jar of loose change just to buy a ticket. As he sat near the back of the rattling bus, smelling of stale diesel and despair, he convinced himself that this could be fixed. He told himself that if he could just get her in a room, turn on the old charm and apologize, she would fold. She was Coralie after all. Soft, forgiving, coupon-clipping Coralie. He just needed to remind her of those late nights by the Charles River, before the money and the firm got in the way. He arrived in the financial district just as a cold drizzle began to fall. The Kensington Global Trust headquarters was a towering, black glass monolith that seemed to swallow the sky, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying power. Bradley pushed through the heavy revolving doors into the cavernous marble-floored lobby. His previously bespoke Italian suit was now deeply wrinkled, smelling faintly of stale sweat and cheap alcohol. He approached the pristine, minimalist reception desk, desperately trying to muster his old, arrogant courtroom charm. "I need to see Coralie Kensington," Bradley demanded, projecting his voice to hide the tremor in his hands. "Tell her it's her husband." The intimidatingly polished receptionist didn't even blink. She didn't look impressed, nor did she look intimidated. She simply typed silently on her glowing keyboard, her eyes flicking up to a subtle security monitor embedded in the desk. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" she asked, her voice a cool, automated hum. "I don't need an appointment. I'm Bradley Hayes. Just call up to her office. Tell her I'm downstairs." Before the receptionist could reply, two massive security guards materialized from behind a set of frosted glass doors. Bradley instantly recognized them as the silent, terrifying men who had flanked Arthur Pendleton in the courtroom. They closed the distance in seconds, flanking Bradley with military precision. "Mr. Hayes," the guard on his left said, his voice a low, gravelly threat that vibrated in Bradley's chest. "You are trespassing. Miss Kensington has a standing, Level 1 security directive regarding your presence on any Kensington-owned property worldwide. You need to leave. Now." "I just need 5 minutes," Bradley shouted, his composure completely shattering as the guards took him by the elbows. The physical strength of the men was overwhelming. They lifted him slightly off the polished marble floor, their grips like iron vices, steering him rapidly toward the revolving doors. "Coralie! Coralie, please! Tell her I'm here. I have nothing. They took everything." They shoved him roughly through the doors and out onto the unforgiving pavement of Wall Street. Bradley stumbled, scraping his hands on the wet concrete as the cold drizzle soaked through his thin suit jacket. As he scrambled to his knees, gasping for breath, a sleek, black, heavily armored Maybach pulled smoothly up to the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The tinted rear window rolled down just a few inches with a quiet, mechanical whir. Coralie sat in the back seat, bathed in the soft, cool glow of a tablet resting on her lap. She wore a tailored, charcoal grey blazer that echoed the formidable style of Arthur Pendleton. She looked flawless, untouchable, and utterly indifferent. Bradley lunged toward the car, but the security guards effortlessly pinned him back against a street lamp. "Coralie!" he sobbed, the rain mixing with the tears streaming down his face. "You can't leave me like this. We were married. I made a mistake. Please, just look at me." Coralie slowly turned her head. She looked at him. She didn't look angry, or vindictive, or sad. She looked at him the exact way he used to look at her across the kitchen table in their Boston apartment, like she was a stranger who simply didn't belong in his world. "You didn't make a mistake, Bradley," Coralie said, her voice carrying clearly and calmly through the crisp, damp city air, slicing through his desperate pleas. "You made a choice. You chose the post-nup. You chose Jessica. You chose to humiliate me. I am simply honoring the financial separation you so desperately demanded." She held his gaze for one final, devastating second, then tapped a silver button on her armrest. The thick, tinted window slid up, sealing her away from him forever. The Maybach glided smoothly into the relentless current of the Manhattan traffic, leaving Bradley standing on the curb, shivering and utterly alone, dwarfed by the towering monuments of a world he would never, ever conquer. 6 months after the explosive revelation that shattered courtroom 302, the legal dissolution of the marriage was finalized. The final hearing was a remarkably brief, almost ghostly affair. Suffolk County Family Court felt cavernous and hollow on that dreary Tuesday morning. There were no gasps from the gallery, no theatrical pacing from expensive lawyers, and no arrogant smirks. Judge Miriam Davis sat at the bench, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the final decree. Across the room, Bradley Hayes sat entirely alone at the petitioner's table. He was representing himself. His bespoke Italian suit had been sold to a luxury consignment shop months ago. Today, he wore a slightly ill-fitting, off-the-rack jacket that hung loosely on his thinning frame. The stress of the past half-year had aged him a decade. Dark, bruising circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the scarred wooden table. Coralie was not there. She didn't need to be. She was represented by a polite, ruthlessly efficient junior partner from Arthur Pendleton's New York firm, who submitted the final paperwork with clinical precision. Per the ironclad post-nuptial agreement that Gregory Walsh had so proudly drafted, the very document Bradley had used as a weapon to leave Coralie with nothing, all marital assets were divided exactly as they were owned prior to the dissolution. Coralie retained her trillion-dollar inheritance, her vast global corporate holdings, and her absolute privacy. Bradley retained his crippling debt, his utterly ruined reputation, and the leased 2019 BMW he could no longer afford to insure, which was slated for repossession by the end of the week. Judge Davis signed the paperwork, the scratch of her pen echoing loudly in the silent room. "The marriage is dissolved," she stated, her voice devoid of the dramatic weight that had plagued the initial hearings. "Mr. Hayes, this court is adjourned." Bradley didn't move. He simply stared at the empty chair where Coralie used to sit, the phantom of his former life mocking him. While Bradley was dragged down by the undertow of his own arrogance, Coralie Kensington rose to the surface, breathing free air for the first time in years. The transition from the frugal, unassuming Coralie Miller to the helm of a trillion-dollar global syndicate was not merely a change in tax brackets. It was an absolute metamorphosis. Under Arthur Pendleton's rigorous, fiercely protective guidance, Coralie stepped out of the shadows her father had built and into the blinding light of the global stage. She did not hoard the wealth. She weaponized it. Within 4 months of the divorce filing, she established the Kensington Foundation for Economic Empowerment, an aggressive philanthropic engine funded by an unprecedented $20 billion endowment. Its primary mission was singular and unforgiving, providing elite legal representation, secure housing, and total financial relocation grants to spouses trapped in economically abusive marriages. Coralie became a global phenomenon. She graced the covers of Forbes and Time magazines, hailed not just as the wealthiest woman on the planet, but as a formidable, uncompromising advocate for the vulnerable. In her interviews, she wore impeccably tailored power suits, speaking with a calm, terrifying eloquence about the insidious nature of financial control and the illusion of class superiority. She never mentioned Bradley by name. She didn't have to. To her, He was no longer a person. He was merely the catalyst that had forged her iron will. She had taken the trauma of her starter wife, years, and transmuted it into a shield for thousands of others. Conversely, the legal community in Boston had thoroughly and efficiently excommunicated Bradley. The story of the arrogant junior partner who had accidentally drafted himself out of a $1 trillion fortune was too juicy to keep quiet. He was a walking punchline. Worse, the quiet but devastating inquiry into his misuse of corporate funds at Harrison, Ford and Wright led to the formal suspension of his law license. Gregory Walsh, realizing Bradley was a dry well, had successfully sued him for $80,000 in unpaid legal fees. The cascading debt forced Bradley out of his luxury Beacon Hill apartment and straight into a brutal, humiliating Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy. Stripped of his credentials, his wealth, and his pride, he was forced to flee Massachusetts entirely, just to find an employer who didn't know his face. On a freezing, sleet-covered Tuesday morning in late November, Bradley clocked into his shift. He was now living in a cramped, mold-scented studio apartment in suburban New Jersey, working as a freelance document reviewer for a bottom-tier legal outsourcing firm. It was a gig economy purgatory. He spent 10 hours a day in a windowless, aggressively fluorescent basement, staring at a flickering monitor, highlighting redundant clauses in low-level insurance contracts for $14 an hour. During his strictly mandated 15-minute lunch break, Bradley sat alone at a wobbly formica table in the sterile break room. The air smelled of burnt coffee and ozone. He unwrapped a cheap, pre-packaged turkey sandwich and reached for the remote on the communal table, turning on the small, wall-mounted television simply to drown out the maddening hum of the ventilation system. The screen flickered to life, tuning into a major global financial news network. Bradley took a bite of his sandwich, tasting absolutely nothing. Then, the chyron at the bottom of the screen flashed in bold, urgent letters. Kensington Trust acquires majority stake in European green energy sector. Bradley froze. The camera cut to a live, high-definition broadcast of a press conference in Geneva, Switzerland. There stood Coralie. She was flanked by international dignitaries, ministers of energy, and the ever-stoic Arthur Pendleton. She wore a stunning, deep emerald coat, her hair perfectly styled, her posture radiating absolute authority. She was speaking confidently, outlining a sweeping, multi-billion-dollar initiative to transition impoverished global regions to renewable energy grids. She looked radiant. She looked untouchable. She looked entirely at peace. Bradley stared at the screen, the cheap bread turning to ash in his dry mouth. His mind violently pulled him back to the cramped apartment in South Boston. He remembered mocking her thrift store sweaters. He remembered rolling his eyes at her budget spreadsheets. He remembered looking her dead in the eye, high on his own manufactured success, and telling her she belonged in a kiddie pool while he swam with the sharks. He had held the winning lottery ticket in his hands. Not just the unimaginable wealth, but the genuine, unwavering love of a woman who had been willing to hide the entire world from him just to see his true heart. And he had torn it to shreds, piece by piece, because he thought he was better than her. The break room door swung open. A young, exhausted-looking co-worker trudged in, his shoulders slumped as he poured a cup of stale, lukewarm coffee. He stopped and glanced up at the television, watching Coralie command the attention of the global press. "Man," the co-worker muttered, shaking his head in absolute awe. "Imagine being married to someone with that kind of power. You'd never have to worry about a single thing for the rest of your life. Talk about hitting the jackpot." Bradley didn't answer. He couldn't force a single syllable past the suffocating lump in his throat. He simply lowered his head, staring blindly down at the bruised apple and the sad, cheap sandwich on the table. As the fluorescent lights of the basement buzzed mockingly above him, Bradley Hayes buried his face in his hands and wept silently into the dark. The tragic downfall of Bradley Hayes serves as a stark, unforgiving reminder that true poverty is rarely a matter of bank accounts. It is a profound bankruptcy of character. In his blind pursuit of status and his vicious cruelty toward a woman he deemed beneath him, Bradley constructed the very cage that would ultimately trap him. He chased the illusion of wealth, completely blind to the unimaginable fortune, both financial and emotional, that sat quietly across the dinner table from him for 7 years. Coralie Kensington's triumph was not merely inheriting an empire, but escaping a man whose arrogance was his own undoing. Ultimately, the gavel did not just divide their assets. It weighed their souls, leaving one to inherit the earth and the other to choke on the ashes of his own hubris.